Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. So today I want to talk to you about using non-traditional data sources to capture human mobility. So here we're talking about some of the data that we saw this morning, mobile phone data, social media data, any sort of data capturing location. And I'm going to focus really on the challenges of looking at those data, and so how we capture mobility, how we use the data, and all of the different problems that we have. So, and I'm going to be kind of looking into what's been done, so some of good practices, and what remains to be done. Oh, is this one? Oh, this one here. Okay, good. So I guess I don't have to convince you that human mobility is important across a set of different dimensions. So I think today Benjamin did a really good job. Oh no, sorry, it was David Gonzalez. So looking across different sectors, transportation, finance, retail, health. So I'm not gonna go into that then. So I'm gonna, I guess, refer you to these two different articles that we have. So some of the ideas I'm gonna be talking today, so they build off from these two pieces of work. So one is more general, looking at big data in human mobility, so to capture human behavior and different geographical processes. And the other one is a more recent report that we published in the Alan Turing Institute, part of a project with some colleagues at the University of Liverpool. And so it's the results of a workshop with different experts on human mobility. So if you are interested in this, so please take a photo, have a look. So, and I guess the first thing that I want to do is ask how many of you guys have worked with human mobility data? Can you raise your hand? Okay, quite a good number. So though there are some people that haven't, so I guess just to get everyone on the same page, when we talk about human mobility, so we are talking very complex data. And we have at least three different elements. So we capture the origin, so here, right, and the destination. And then we capture an interaction between two places. And that is captured by movement, so one individual moving between different locations, or it could be, in the aggregate, it could be a count of different people moving between locations. And then you could have several people from one origin and several people going to different destinations. So then when you expand that, so it's a very complicated sort of data to handle when you add time and all of that. And that's what I want to be looking at today. In terms of, so what sort of data are we talking about? So there are a bunch of different data, different technologies on how we capture mobility data. So one of them is CDRC, called detailed records, or XDR, so which is an extended version of the detailed records of mobile phone data. We have GPS, Bluetooth, and also smart card data. So those probably are the main sort of sources of mobility data today. And here we have, depending on the kind of source, the kind of technology that you use to capture mobility data, you end up with different levels of spatial resolution and temporal resolution. So you go from a relatively coarse level of aggregation when you look at CDRs, XDRs, and then you go down to Bluetooth, which captures a lot more detailed data. And also then is the kind of data that you can generate in terms of mobility data, so it's quite different depending on the source that you get the data from. So from CDRs, for example, so you get what is an origin destination matrix, so aggregate data looking and counting the number of people moving between an origin and a destination. But then if you look at GPS, for example, in addition to being able to construct origin destination matrices, what you can build is also the trajectory of individuals across different locations throughout the day. So similarly with Bluetooth, so you have similar capabilities, so very detailed data. And with Bluetooth, you have the additional advantage of being able to actually capture mobility indoor places. And I guess one important point that I want to make here, that then the rest of the things I'm going to be talking about, so they're all related to this issue, that many of these data, they are a consequence of sort of an admin process, right? So the data that all of these technologies capture, so it's not for research or analytical purposes, but it's just as a byproduct of how the different technologies operate. So what that does is that imposes a lot of different challenges. So we have seen a lot of the opportunities. So people have been talking today about the different opportunities about capturing mobility, footfall, and all of the advantages across different sectors of the economy, the society. But we have talked less about all of the different challenges that this data, analyzing this data and manipulating this data actually involves. And I want to be focusing on that a bit today. So we have challenges across 3 different areas. And I'm going to start that by looking at issues related or challenges related to ethics and privacy. So one of the first is, so I think that there has been quite a lot of development, good practice on looking and developing different methods of anonymizing data, differential privacy approaches, so introducing nodes to data, dropping cases where you have very low numbers of people. So there is some good progress there. However, I think we haven't really addressed the question of this kind of trade-off that we have between privacy and accuracy. So if you look at this, right, so there is a trade-off here that we need to accept, and I think the challenge is finding the sweet spot here where we stand on this. So you can go, all the way, very, increasing privacy over here, but then what happens is that you end up with data that are not very accurate, so not usable, right? And on the other extreme, what you get is you lose privacy, you make the data anonymized, and you gain high precision, but is it that ethical? So probably not, right? So then I think there is a job there on finding, where we sit here, what is reasonable to expect from this data, and I think there is some work to be done there. So the second issue related to ethics and privacy is the idea that lots of the data, the mobility data, so they are captured by private corporations. So of course they are not obliged to share the data with users, right? So then there is an issue there on accessing the data. So the data, the raw data could be available, may not be make available. It may be available for some time, but not in the future. So then that has a lot of consequences in terms of whether the analyses are replicable, reproducible, and that is important for data, so validation processes, validation of results, but also for creating opportunities into developing new insights, building on existing work. So that is another issue that probably we need to look into. The other big area of challenges is data. So the first key issue, I think, is data accessibility, and so making the data accessible, but also being able to find the data. So there are different ways on how different companies and different platforms, businesses make the data accessible. In some cases, there has been some really good progress on making the data available by APIs, using different platforms, pre-processing the data, signing a contract, getting access to the data. So there are some good examples on doing that. But again, so there is quite a lot of variability. So I think we need a bit of, so establish some sort of standards on how we access the data and who can access the data, because At the minute, the data, the access to the data is very unequal across the academia, across users. So I think there is some work to be done there. There are some good examples, though. So the CDRC, Consumer Data Research Center. So there has been, they have made the data available in a way that is secure, so it's ethical. You can access the data, look at anonymized records, but still look at a high granular level of detail of data, and also the metadata, so that makes the data transparent, looking at what is the content of the data, what is the period that it captures, what is the population that it covers, which is not the case in general. So another big challenge is integration and interoperability of the data. So one of the things that we see with mobility data is that they are in a data digital environment where you have the data on mobility. But the data in mobility itself is kind of useful, as we've seen throughout the day. But it also got limitations, right? So you got only the location of people at a point in time. So what you want to do is enrich the data to be able to understand what are the impacts of mobility and what are the consequences or the causes of mobility. Yeah, so usually what you want to be able to do is to be able to understand something else looking at mobility data. So, and the problem is that those other data, so auxiliary data, they tend to sit on different digital platforms. And it's difficult to integrate those. So it's difficult to export data between different platforms. So, and again, so there is some work to be done. So this was a big issue during the COVID pandemic, where the government wanted to export different data sources between different digital platforms, but that couldn't be done because of the governance related to the data and, again, maintaining privacy. So that is another thing that we need to look into. Another issue here is biases. I think we've been talking of biases today. So there are two sources of biases when we use mobility data. One source of bias is access to the technology, access to devices, which we know is unequal. So that's been quite explored. So we know that mobility data tend to be quite biased in terms of urban, educated, healthy, young, middle-aged individuals. They tend to be more represented in the data than other segments of the populations. So, but there is another source of bias here, which is the intensity at which people tend to use the technology, which is another source of bias, and that is less well explored. So there is a nice paper here that was recently published, so as a preprint, where they look at this issue about the different intensity of users and trying to measure the biases in that particular context. So, and as you can see here, so there is on your left, there is a high intensity user or a high intensity user. So, and in that case, you can capture the whole trajectory of that person through the use of the technology. However, when you look at low intensity user, what tends to happen is that you tend to miss segments of that trace. So in this particular case, you miss that part of the trajectory here, that segment of the trajectory. So there are some biases there that are less well explored, and then we need some research on looking at that. And I guess the final area, the third area of challenges here has to do with methodology. So one of the things is the lack of standard practices. I think we've been talking about that quite a lot during the day. So, and although there has been some good practice on identifying and processing a lot of the mobility data, and that is identifying home location, work locations, different places, right, through mobility data, there isn't a standard practice on what are the guiding principles defining what those locations are. And then also what is challenging is that once you have identified those places using mobility data, it's really hard to actually validate that those places are what you are saying that they are, right? So that home locations are home locations, and then how you validate whether, so I think there was a good question today about how you validate the location of retail locations. So you have a multi-story place. So how you attribute people according to the location data. And it's where I think we need more transparent practices about validation and ways to validate the data. So another point has to be with generalization of the findings of the mobility data. So as I said before, right? So there is an issue of biases. And the key question is, so once you analyze the data, how you make those findings of the data general to represent the whole population. So there has been some good some development, right? So applying reweighting, resampling, particularly applying post-stratification methods to make the data representative of the population. However, one of the issues is that a lot of the work has been done using census data, taking census data as the gold standard. And I think the issue is, when you use census data, is that the census data, right, so they tend to be pretty outdated, right? So in the UK, we're talking about a census that was done 10 years ago, and if you are looking at data, in 2021, so it becomes really hard to justify where you're using census. And I think at the end of the day, you end up, with a data set that sort of takes the worst of both worlds. So you end up with data that are not representative of the population, that got biases, but also, and it's probably representing a population that, so an old population, so in 2011 in the UK case. So again, there is some work to be done there. And then the other issue is linking data, mobility data. So because in mobility data, you only got, again, the location for individuals. However, the interesting bit is linking the data to sociodemographics or socioeconomic variables. And so there is some work done, right, linking data in the aggregate sense, so counts of people, to location attributes related to the residential locations of people. However, what we'd be interested in is looking at the individual level, so how you actually mash up individual records and looking at those trajectories in that context. So I guess some final bits here. Well, there are opportunities from mobility data, but also there are some quite big challenges I think we need to navigate through before we can unleash all of those opportunities. And I think where work needs to be done is developing protocols to ensure that the data are fair, so that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So, and that could be through synthetic data, through simulated data. So we also need an integrated digital data environment where we can have a bunch of different data. And in the case of Carto, right, integrating different data sources that we can analyze, that we can combine, integrate. And then we also need frameworks to correct data, to adjust biases, but also a set of different tools, so a repository, hopefully, where we have a different set of tools, software that we can go and look for relevant practices to analyze mobility data. Thank you. Thank you.